Montana Territory. May 1882, the storm hit just after dusk, sweeping across the plains like a freight train of wind and cold, and the canvas roof above Zadie Prescott's head did not stand a chance. Rain slipped through the seams of the old wagon, dripping down onto her threadbare blanket and soaking her boots at the foot of the cot. She curled tighter around her knees, trying to stay warm, but the chill got into her bones like it had been waiting for her to be alone and too tired to fight it off. Lightning flashed. Thunder cracked so loud it rattled the pots hung on the wall. Her little wagon groaned under the weight of the wind. She had parked it near the edge of the tree line off the main trail to keep away from town eyes. Folks in Three Forks had been kind enough to sell her flour and some beans, but not much else. A woman her age, 23, alone, no husband, no kin, drew questions she had no interest in answering anymore. She wrapped the blanket tighter and looked over at the small wooden box tucked under the cot. Inside were all the papers that proved her name, her mother's wedding ring, and the last $5 she had. She had planned to drive the wagon west toward Helena in the morning, maybe try to find work cleaning boarding houses or sewing. But the rain was not stopping and the wagon roof was giving up more by the minute. A hard knock came on the wagon door. Zadie flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. "Hello." A man's voice called through the storm. "You all right in there?" She hesitated. Then she reached for the rifle behind her cot, kept it low, and cracked the door an inch. A man stood in the rain, soaked to the bone. His hat drooped with water and dark curls plastered to his forehead. His horse stood behind him, reins loose in his hand. He looked to be about 30, maybe a little older, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of river stone. He did not seem drunk or wild, just concerned. "Name's Jonah Jessup," he said, raising his voice over the storm. "I have a ranch 2 miles east. Saw the wagon earlier today when I was checking fence lines. Figured I'd come see if anyone needed help with the rain coming." "I am fine," Zadie said, her voice tight. "You are not," he said, glancing up at the leaking roof. "That ain't a roof. Come sleep in a real home." She stared at him. "I do not know you." "No, ma'am, you do not," Jonah said. "But I got clean blankets, a stove going, and a roof that does not drip on your head while you sleep. You can have my sister's old room. She married and moved on last year. Door locks from the inside." Zadie looked past him at the shadows between the trees. The storm was not letting up. Her boots were already wet and her fingers were starting to go numb. She could not afford to get sick. Not again. She swallowed hard. "Let me get my box." Jonah waited while she packed the small wooden box into her satchel and wrapped her thin coat around her shoulders. She stepped down into the mud and he offered his hand without a word. She did not take it. He did not push. He helped her up onto his horse, then climbed up behind her. She held herself stiff as stone, but he kept a respectful distance. The ride was slow through the dark and rain. The only sound was thunder and hooves in the mud. When they reached the ranch house, a wide log cabin with light spilling from the windows, Zadie could not help but stare. It was not fancy, but it was solid and warm-looking, and smoke curled from the chimney. Jonah dismounted, tied his horse, then helped her down. He opened the front door. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. She crossed the threshold, her wet boots squeaking on the hardwood floor. The inside smelled of firewood and coffee. A fire crackled in the hearth. The kitchen was clean, simple wooden table, cast iron stove, and a kettle steaming gently. A coat rack held a few hats and a woman's shawl. He led her down a short hallway. "You can sleep here," he said, opening a door. The room was small, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window with a curtain. A quilt lay folded at the end of the bed. "Sheets are clean." "You can lock the door if you want." She stepped in, soaked to the skin, and stared. I will leave you be, Jonah said, already backing up. If you need dry clothes, I can knock. My sister left a few things. She shut the door and locked it. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. She had not slept inside a real house in over a year. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the window, soft and golden. Zadie woke warm for the first time in weeks. She blinked, sat up slowly, and saw a folded dress on the dresser. A soft blue one, simple but clean. There was a note in neat handwriting. Figured you would not want to wear wet boots. Borrow these till yours dry. Zadie touched the dress, fingers brushing the fabric. She changed into it, brushed out her hair with her fingers, and stepped out into the hallway. Jonah stood in the kitchen, flipping cornbread in a pan. He turned when he heard her steps. "Morning," he said with a nod. "Hope you slept all right." She eyed the stove. "Better than I have in months." He smiled just a little and poured her a cup of coffee. She accepted it without speaking. They sat across from each other at the table. He did not press her for details. She was grateful for that. She did not want to talk about the wagon, or how her father had died last spring, or how the man she had been promised to ran off with someone else and left her with nothing but a name and a broken cart. After breakfast, she stood and said, "I can help. My mother taught me to sew. If you have mending." Jonah looked at her for a long moment. "I could use help with the horses and the garden, and mending too." She nodded. Day turned to evening. She helped him patch a fence. He showed her the chicken coop and the smokehouse. She was quiet, and so was he, but something settled between them, not heavy, not rushed, just real. That night she went back to the room, but before she closed the door she turned. "Thank you," she said softly. Jonah nodded. "You are welcome here, Zadie." She closed the door, heart thudding. And for the first time in a year, she did not feel like she was running anymore. The next morning, Zadie stood on the porch with her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back. The barn roof caught the early light, and the air smelled of damp grass and horses. Jonah was already by the corral, laying oats into a trough with a quiet, measured rhythm. She stepped down onto the packed dirt and crossed the yard without a word. He glanced over, gave a single nod, then passed her a bridle. "Chestnut mare in the far stall," he said. "She's gentle, but tosses her head when she's hungry." Zadie took the bridle and moved toward the barn. The mare snorted as she entered, ears flicking back, but Zadie kept her movement slow. Her mother had taught her to approach horses like she did people, with steadiness and respect. She slipped the bridle on and led the mare out into the light. By the time the sun was halfway up the sky, they had the corral cleared, the trough scrubbed, and tack hung to dry. Jonah leaned on the fence post, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. Zadie crouched beside the water pump, rinsing her hands. "You ever break a horse?" he asked, watching her. "I've watched it done," she said. "My father traded with wranglers passing through Kansas when I was younger. I never liked how rough they were." He tilted his head. "You think there's another way? I think there has to be." Jonah took that in without comment, just nodded slow like he was tucking it away. Then he turned toward the shed and said, "I've got a colt near 2 years. Won't let me near him most days. Maybe you could try." She followed him to the shed and looked over the fence. The colt was dark with a blaze down his nose, pacing the edge of the pen, ears twitching. "Name's Flint," Jonah said. "Stubborn as dry mud." Zadie didn't answer. She stepped up to the fence and rested her arms on the top rail. Flint stopped pacing and stared at her. That evening she sat on the back steps with a bowl of beans in her lap. Jonah joined her, his plate balanced on his knee. The sun dipped behind the hills, painting the far side of the valley in burnt gold. "You planning on heading to Helena?" he asked after a long stretch of quiet. "I was," she said. "Before the storm," he nodded, then set his plate down beside him. You still plan to. Zadie looked out across the pasture. A hawk wheeled far overhead, riding the last of the warm air. I don't know, she said, her voice soft. I hadn't thought past the road. Jonah picked up a twig and turned it between his fingers. I could use steady help, not just mending. The garden's overgrown and I need someone who sees things I don't. Zadie turned toward him, her face unreadable in the fading light. You offering me a job, I'm offering you a place, he said. If you want it. She didn't answer right away. The wind moved across the grass, lifting the edge of her skirt. She looked down at her hands, then back up. All right, she said. I'll stay, for a while. Jonah didn't smile. He just gave a slow, sure nod like something unspoken between them had shifted. Inside, the fire still burned low in the hearth. She carried her bowl to the basin and washed it clean, then dried it with a cloth folded neatly on the counter. She noticed a small carving in the windowsill above the basin, two initials, carved close together. MJ and SJ. Your parents? She asked, brushing her fingers over the letters. Jonah stood near the door, arms crossed. My brother and his wife. He passed 3 winters ago. She moved back to Missouri. Zadie let her hand fall away. Loss stays longer than folks think. Yeah, he said. It does. That night she left her door open a crack, not wide enough to see through, but just enough to hear the sounds of the house settle around her. Outside, the sky cleared. The moon rose full and quiet, casting pale light across the fields. And for the first time in a long while, Zadie Prescott slept without waking in the dark. The garden lay behind the barn, tucked between a windbreak of cottonwoods and a low stone wall that looked older than the house itself. Zadie crouched in the early light, fingers deep in loamy earth, pulling up clumps of wild mustard and creeping thistle. Her knees ached against the packed ground, but she welcomed the discomfort. It made her feel solid, useful. Jonah had left before sunrise to check on a neighbor's cattle. He'd said little before riding out, just a quiet, back by supper, and the soft clink of his spurs fading into the hush of morning. She hadn't expected him to linger. He wasn't the lingering sort. A robin chirped in the branches overhead, and Zadie pushed a lock of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. Beside her, a basket slowly filled with weeds and broken roots. She worked steadily, careful not to disturb the rows of carrots and beets that had managed to survive under the mess. Someone had once cared for this patch of earth. She paused, brushing dirt from her hands, and looked toward the shed. Flint stood near the far gate, his ears forward, watching her. She hadn't approached him since that first day. They were still figuring each other out. He didn't bolt when she moved closer, just shifted his weight and let out a low breath. You're not as mean as you pretend, she said quietly. He flicked his tail. By late afternoon, the sun had risen high and sharp, and Zadie's sleeves were damp with sweat. She stood at the pump, drawing water into the tin basin, when hoofbeats stirred the dust up the road. She turned as Jonah rode in, his shirt clinging to his back and the brim of his hat pulled low. He dismounted without a word, tied the reins, and ran a hand along his horse's neck. Then he looked toward her. Neighbor's bull got himself tangled in wire, he said. Took near 3 hours to cut him loose. Did he make it? Bled some, but he'll walk. Zadie nodded, wiping her hands on her skirt. I cleared the back rows. There's potatoes under all that mess. He set his hat on the fence rail and stepped to the basin. The water was warm from the sun, but he plunged his hands in without flinching. You know how to dig a root cellar? He asked. I've seen one dug. Never done it myself. I'll show you tomorrow. They stood in silence. Then Jonah dried his hands on his trouser legs and looked at the garden. My mother used to plant marigolds around the edges, he said. Said they kept beetles out. Zadie glanced at the bare edge of the plot. I could try to find some seed, he shrugged. You don't have to. I want to. He didn't answer, but his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than usual before he turned toward the barn. That night, after the dishes were scrubbed and the lamps turned down, Zadie sat at the small writing desk in her borrowed room. She opened her satchel and removed a folded scrap of paper, an old ledger page with a list in her father's hand. It was a supply list, mostly flour and salt, but at the bottom, beneath a smear of ink, it read, "Zadie boots, books, oranges if they got him." She traced the line with her fingertip, remembering how he used to bring back little things when he could, small kindnesses in a hard life. A soft knock sounded at the door. She stood, cautious still, and opened it halfway. Jonah held a wooden crate between his hands. "Found this tucked behind the smokehouse," he said. "Thought it might be yours." She took it from him, the weight unexpected. Inside were her dried goods from the Wagon beans, a tin of lard, and a small cloth bag of coffee she thought had gone missing. She looked up. "I thought someone took it." "Guess not." She opened the door a little wider. "Thank you," he nodded. "You settling in all right?" She hesitated, then stepped back slightly, allowing him to see the room. He didn't enter, just looked at the folded quilt, the basin of clean water, the boots by the bed. "I am," she said. "It's strange, though. Not having to listen for every sound. I know the feeling." She watched the line of his jaw shift as he looked past her toward the window. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Used to," he said. "After my brother, I thought maybe I'd sell the place, but the land's in my blood." "Hard to walk from that," Zadie nodded. "I used to think I didn't belong anywhere, and now," she didn't answer, but her eyes didn't leave his. He tipped his head slightly. "Good night, Zadie." "Good night, Jonah." When she closed the door, she didn't lock it. By late June, the earth had dried enough for digging. Jonah walked ahead with the spade balanced across his shoulders, and Zadie followed with a tin pail of nails and 2 folded burlap sacks. They crossed the pasture behind the house, where the cottonwoods thinned and the soil turned darker with the memory of old riverbeds. He stopped on a small rise above the creek bend and set the spade in the dirt. "This spot holds shade through summer. Won't flood come spring thaw." Zadie laid down the sacks and knelt to test the ground. The soil broke easy under her fingers. "This'll keep potatoes good through winter." Jonah nodded and began to dig. She worked beside him, steady and silent, until sweat ran down her back and the smell of earth filled her nose. The work was hard, but they fell into rhythm, one digging, the other hauling loose dirt to the edge with a bucket. Midday passed. The hole deepened. When she straightened to stretch her spine, Jonah offered a tin cup filled from the creek. She drank and passed it back, brushing her sleeve across her brow. "You always lived alone out here?" she asked. "No," he said. "Used to be 5 of us. Brother, sister, their spouses, me." She waited. "Brother died sudden," he continued. "Fever. His wife left after the thaw. Sister married a man from Deer Lodge, took the wagon and didn't look back." Zadie leaned on the shovel, gaze fixed on the horizon. "You ever think of following her?" "I thought maybe I would. But leaving's different when your roots are sunk deep." She looked at him then, really looked. His shirt clung to his back, his hands were cracked and strong, and the lines at the corners of his eyes ran deeper than even his years should allow. He was a man formed by stillness, not distance. "You're not afraid of being alone?" she asked. "I was," he said. "But sometimes quiet's the only thing that listens back." That evening, after the cellar was framed and covered with pine boards, they sat on the edge of the porch, boots dusted and shirts damp. Zadie ran her thumb along a splinter in the railing. "I've been thinking of buying a loom," she said. "If I can find someone selling cheap, I know how to weave. Could trade cloth in town." Jonah looked over. "You think you'd want to stay long enough for that?" She didn't answer right away. "I think I might," she said finally. He leaned back on his elbows. Then I'll clear space in the storage room. If you find a loom, it'll have a place to stand." They stayed like that until the crickets found their rhythm. When Jonah rose to take the lantern inside, Zadie followed. The house had taken on a rhythm of its own. She knew which floorboard creaked outside the pantry, which window stuck when the wind came from the east. Her boots found those spots without thinking now. After she washed up, she found a folded scrap of paper on the desk in her room. Not a note, but a page torn from some old ledger. On it, in rough pencil, was a list in Jonah's hand. Extra feed, shovel handle, saddle leather, marigold seed. She touched her fingers to the last line. In the morning, she would ride into town with him and check the mercantile. Maybe they'd have seed, maybe not. But she'd ask. Because the garden had a bare edge, and she knew now what to do with it. The loom arrived by wagon in early August, bundled in burlap and smelling faintly of cedar. Zadie stood in the barn's open doorway as the deliveryman hauled it down with Jonah's help. It was older, with iron foot pedals and wooden pegs dulled from use, but its frame was sturdy and the tension bar still true. She traced one of the crossbeams with her thumb and felt something settle in her chest, a quiet click, like a door swinging open in a long, empty room. Jonah carried it into the storage room himself, clearing space near the window where the light came in strongest. He didn't speak while he worked, but when he set the last beam in place and wiped his hands on his trousers, he looked at her. "You'll need a chair with a low back," he said. "I can cut one down from the shed." Zadie nodded once. "I'll start with linen, easier to find thread for. I've got a pattern in mind." He didn't ask what it was. That evening, she sat at the loom with yarn looped over her lap, hands moving slow and careful. The shuttle whispered against the threads, and the rhythm came back to her body like a remembered lullaby. Jonah passed behind her once, carrying a bucket from the root cellar, and paused just long enough to rest his hand on the edge of the doorframe. He didn't speak. She didn't turn. 2 weeks later, the cloth was finished. She set it out in the sun on the fence rail, the pattern catching golden light rows of narrow diamonds, pale blue and wheat-colored, tight woven and even. Jonah ran his hand along the edge as he passed by that afternoon, then looked up. "You make that from memory." "Partly," she said. "The rest came as I worked." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded and kept walking. Later that night, thunder rolled low along the western sky, far off but steady. Jonah lit a lamp and set it on the table while Zadie stitched the hem of a new curtain for the kitchen window. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the scrape of Jonah's boot heel as he leaned back in his chair. He watched her hands. "You planning on selling those?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "but not until I've made enough to keep one for the house." He grunted. "Wouldn't mind seeing that pattern again." She smiled just a little. "Maybe I'll teach you." His brow lifted. "Me, you've steady hands," she said. "You'd be good at it." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You think about what comes next." "I do," she said, setting the cloth down. "But not in the way I used to." Jonah stood and crossed to the hearth, setting a fresh log on the coals. The flames caught with a soft rush of heat. He turned and looked at her, not hesitant, just deliberate. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not just for the weaving. Not just for the help." Zadie folded her hands slowly. "You mean as your wife?" "I do." She stood, quiet and steady, and crossed to him. She reached up and touched his face just below the cheekbone where a faint scar curved toward his ear. "I didn't come here looking for anything but shelter," she said. "But I found a man who listens more than he talks and a home that doesn't ask me to be smaller than I am." He caught her hand in his. "I won't ever ask you to be anything but yourself." She didn't answer, just leaned up and kissed him soft, sure, and long. When they pulled apart, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They married before the first frost. A small gathering, Just the preacher from Three Forks and a neighbor couple who brought a sack of barley and a pie. Zadie wore a dress she'd sewn from undyed muslin, and Jonah wore his father's vest. They stood under the cottonwoods where the light filtered gold through the last of the leaves, and when the vows were spoken, Jonah kissed her like he'd known her forever. The house changed after that, not in structure but in feeling. Zadie's woven cloth hung over the windows, and a second quilt began on the bed. Jonah built a low stool for the loom and a cedar chest for her yarn. She planted marigolds along the garden's edge, and they bloomed stubbornly into October. On quiet nights, they sat on the porch with their knees touching, watching the stars come out one by one. Jonah would reach for her hand without looking, and she'd rest her head on his shoulder, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods. Winter came slow that year, the snow falling light and even. Inside, the fire burned strong and the house stayed warm. Zadie's loom clicked steadily in the back room, and Jonah's boots always found their way home by dusk. They never spoke of leaving again. And when the spring thaw came and the creek filled with meltwater, Zadie stood on the porch with her hands resting on the curve of her belly, and Jonah came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You think it'll be a girl or a boy?" she asked. "Don't rightly care," he said. "As long as they've got your fire." She leaned into him, the smell of pine smoke and wool deep in her lungs, and smiled. They stood like that until the wind quieted and the sky turned soft with evening. And in that quiet, with the land thawing and the world stretching toward bloom, everything that had once been scattered and uncertain settled into place: their hands, their home, their hearts. All of it whole, real, and lasting.